Hey everybody, I'm Steve Moore.
And I'm Mark Castleman.
We know the pain and heartbreak of porn and sex addiction.
And we know the triumph of breaking completely free.
Every day, we help our clients find hope and healing.
Join us in the fight to take back your life, your marriage, and be stronger than ever.
This is the PBSE Squared podcast.
Hey, everybody, Mark and Steve on the PBSE podcast. This is episode 253, and this is a really significant episode for us because we just got word this week that we just crossed the 1 million downloads threshold.
Oh, man.
Wish I had a sound effect. Do I have a sound effect to play applause? Let's see.
There, I've got applause going. Yeah.
I don't know if it played anyway.
It's supposedly playing. Sometimes the recording doesn't pick it up. We need to.
But we played applause. Not applause for us, but applause for you.
Yes.
You know, we know that, man, we're over 1 million downloads. It's been, almost 5 years now?
Yeah.
I think January will be our 5-year anniversary, I think.
Uh-huh.
And, man, over a million downloads in over 204 countries and territories. This just blows us away.
There's only like 15 or 20 countries.
Something like that. And this is all because of all of you, our PBSE listeners. Thank you.
Yeah, we so appreciate all of you.
Do this. You're the reason this is possible. Without you, this wouldn't matter. Just be us talking to ourselves. So we're grateful for all of you. We think about you often, just the efforts you're making, the various challenges and crazy situations and trenches that you find yourselves in, and the fact that you just decide to keep going each day is really miraculous and an amazing example to us.
Yeah.
We have hard days. We're like, you know what? All of our people out there are still continuing on. I guess we will.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Well, we're firm believers that it's never too late to change, right? It's never too late to change your settings, your circumstance, do the next right thing, to take where you're at and to elevate. And we know how much hopelessness accompanies this addiction. And I think that's our big passion. So every time we hear from one of you, every time you send in a question, every time you come support us and support your recovery better by signing up for Dare to Connect or come join us over there, all of those things are just tremendously encouraging for us and help us to want to keep on pushing on for all of you, because we found a whole new way of living as addicts who did it all the wrong ways for a long time. We're glad to be in a better place now, and just appreciate all of you letting us share our story with you. Of course,
our hearts are very soft, and we have a really special place within us for all the betrayed partners. And we love working with addicts and helping guys get into recovery. We love working with betrayed partners to help them heal.
Absolutely.
So we're appreciative, so appreciative of all of you, amazing partners out there. Yeah. Well, speaking of partners, we had a partner write into us.
We did.
And our title, we know our title, sometimes we have sarcastic titles.
This was a little bit sarcastic, admittedly.
But we state them as kind of the submissions have come in, the way those submissions were worded. And this was coming from the aspect of let's assume a porn addict and really heavy addiction. I use porn to learn how to please my partner. That's healthy, right? Mm. And this comes directly from a submission by a partner. And here's what she says. She says, hello, I know you talk about how porn isn't healthy or isn't true intimacy. But what happens when your partner says that they use porn to better learn how to please their partner? I ask because I'm part of a couple of support groups, and there are a good number of women who share that this is the approach of their porn-addicted partners. I know it's an excuse, which, if anything, is an understatement. Is it to possibly, can you possibly do a podcast specifically on this? We all know how porn is not how to learn how to please your partner. And ultimately, it's a cop-out to continue in addiction. In other words, their porn brain justifies it. I do want to note, thankfully, this isn't my husband's mindset, and have to thank both of you for the podcast you post. My husband has shared it has helped him not feel alone or attacked and has helped him stay active in his recovery. So thank you for those kind words. And thank you for being so raw and vulnerable and open and stating what is kind of an elephant in the room in our various cultures around the world. This comes up a lot. Steve, you and I, we haven't just seen this over a couple of decades as we've worked with individuals, addicts and betrayed partners and coupleships. We had a lot of this attitude when we were deep in addiction.
Indeed, we
So
did.
this is very familiar to us. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'll be the, I'm not a guinea pig. I mean, I talk about this all the time. It's funny because, when we get different submissions to the podcast, they'll kind of hit home in different ways. This one just was a dead ringer. It wasn't like, oh, that's kind of close to home or whatever. I distinctly remember sitting down and it's embarrassing to admit this, but at least on two separate occasions, I can remember them and using this exact reasoning to this is a good thing that I'm pulling up this porn because this is going to help me be better in bed with my wife. It's going to be good for my marriage. It's going to be good for my relationship. And this is a good thing that I'm doing this. Like probably one of the more deeply justified, I guess you could say, forays into one of my many into that world, where I genuinely had myself convinced that this was for the greater good, right? It was serving a higher cause, a higher purpose. I was really doing something that was truly going to be of benefit. And so we both can really connect with. It's very easy, I think, for partners to sometimes look at that and think that immediately just dismiss that as addicts will justify anything, right? And there is some truth to that because we can get really creative with how we justify. And there is truth, I think, in the fact that I'm sure this addict partner, to some degree, that is the case as well. But, and as you'll see as we go through this podcast today, sometimes the addict world of thinking becomes so warped and disjointed because, ironically, of the pornography itself. It starts to warp our capacity to even connect with not just what we think we're getting out of the porn, which we really aren't, which we're going to talk about in a minute, but also it starts to erode our ability to even logify and to see the situation cohesively for what it really is, so in other words, the fact that I'd exposed myself so much to pornography was half of the driving reason why now I was using it as a way to justify, well, this is going to make my marriage better.
Yeah, exactly.
We'll talk about that in a minute.
Well, and as we were preparing our notes for this, there was something that really occurred to me pretty strongly. Over the years, I mean, we've been doing this almost 5 years now. Every once in a while, we'll have someone write into us. It's often been a porn using individual who will try to kind of write us off when we tackle these kinds of topics to say, oh, you're trying to force your moral code on us, or, you guys are just religious wackos, and that we don't ever talk about religion on here. In fact, every once in a while we'll talk about spirituality and what that means to each individual, but we don't dictate any of that. So I just felt really strongly I needed to enunciate right up front. This is not a moral episode. Now, we have our own personal beliefs about the moralities and values of pornography and all the various ways that it's crazy, dysfunctional, and destructive and, abusive of human beings and all the rest that we don't need to talk about. But it's very important that all of you listening realize that Steve and I, there are few things that we are more passionate about than healthy human intimacy, healthy human connection, holistic relationships that are filled with tenderness and collaboration and kindness and passion and just wonderful, healthy, whole relationships is a huge passion of ours. And we named our online program because of that, Dare to Connect. So today's discussion is about connection and how this kind of approach gets in the way of that. We're all about are you engaging in anything in your life, this question or any other question that is keeping you from the marvelous, amazing, connected, whole, loving, tender, absolutely wonderful and fantastic relationship that you could have? We are all about getting those barriers out of the way.
For sure.
That's what this podcast is about.
Well, and so let's jump right into it, Mark, because I mean, really, there are a lot of, gosh, where do we even begin? I mean, we there are a lot of obstacles. Doesn't really seem to do it justice, but factors maybe is a better way to put this as we jump into this and tackle this or combat this notion that porn can fulfill this meaningful role, or frankly, any meaningful role. And so let's do. The first thing that we have to really address and acknowledge out there is this heavily again doesn't do it justice, but this sexualized culture that we live in.
Yeah, because Steve,
Um,
you and I said, okay, if we're going to step back and ask, where did this mindset come from? Right? Porn. I use porn to learn how to please my partner. That's healthy, right? This guy just didn't make that up. Neither did any of the people we've worked with,
no,
or we ourselves had felt this way. This came from some specific places in all of our backgrounds, and we need to
yes.
state what those are right now.
Well, and I mean, and we're going to hit on some of these just as we go forward. The sexualized culture, right, places such a tremendous value on sex as a component of overall intimacy. Right now we talk about intimacy on this podcast all the time. We talk about oftentimes the 8 areas of intimacy that we operate in our Dare to Connect program. And it goes without saying, Mark and I, we've discussed and owned the fact that we grew up in I guess you could say in some ways what was a sexually repressed culture of origin.
Mhm.
But what we have seen over our time is that there tends to be no healthy, true middle ground. We tend to have, on the one side, a very conservative, almost demonizing element to the sexual realm where it's, heavily pushed that this is for procreation and nothing else. And it almost gets like a very bad rap or represents something negative, whether it's a lack of self control or overindulgence or something. And then we have this other counterculture that is just sex is the end all be all to everything. All roads lead to sex, right? That value set is upheld in everything that you come across in pop culture today: sitcoms, comedies, movies, film, video, music. Think about every genre of media medium that you or your family is exposed to, and the sexual component is completely gone askew in terms of a healthy place. So we have this one uber conservative side on the one hand, we have this uber whatever you'd call it on the other hand. And we and these two worlds are just completely disjointed out of what Mark and I regard as where the true place for sex and sexuality lies in life.
Yeah,
Where
exactly.
it is it is a benefit and it is a critical piece to 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 intimacy. Frankly, a much more important piece than Mark or I were ever raised to believe. But
Absolutely.
but by the same token, it operates in tandem and in balance with all of these other areas.
Yeah, you just said we have 8 areas of intimacy that we talk about. This is one of them, one
Yes.
of 8, right? And as we talk about this sexualized culture or a rigid, really
Repressed
rigid,
culture.
repressed culture, either one of those is what we call the grand setup from our earliest youth.
Mm-hmm.
And what I've seen, Steve and I have had the opportunity to work with a lot of teenagers. My wife and I raised 6 of them. I've worked with a lot of teens who have issues, and sadly, too many teens look to what as their primary sex education? Pornography and their peers that are influenced by that pornography
Correct.
is where too many teens and young adults get their quote sex education today. And then as we've worked with a lot of these young people, they feel pressured to quote be in the know. If you don't know what this is and how to do that and how to engage in that, then you're not cool. You're not going to get dates. You're not going to be thought of as, hot or awesome. So you get all this education and then you feel pressured to put it into practice. And then on top of all of that we just said, now bring into the fact that we're in a porn addiction pandemic, an epidemic at younger and younger ages.
Yes.
And then all of the defense mechanisms that you'll then put into place to protect that addiction, because it becomes your primary coping mechanism for difficulties in life. So this question, that this attitude that was expressed, I had this attitude all the time.
Yeah.
In my deep addiction years, I was going to protect my ability to go to that reliable, accessible, instantly gratifying outlet, I was going to protect that at all costs. So what's one way to protect it? Rationalization, justification, minimization. Hey, this is helping me learn how to please my partner. Yep, protect that outlet at all costs. So everything I just said, we could do a whole podcast on all the causes of this, but are you starting to see the complexity and the hugeness of why we can end up in this kind of a mindset? Makes a lot of sense, doesn't it?
Well, and there's just so many sources for this. I mean, I'm just thinking back over all the clients that I've worked with over the years, right? The ones that we work in D2C. I mean, so many things in this culture component become linked to sex that were never meant to be linked to it.
Yes.
I mean, case in point, I'm thinking of a past client right now where he was kind of awkward, didn't really fit in, and then all of a sudden one day he found his in with the cool kids. His dad had a porn stash that he could share with his buddies.
Mm.
And he went from being kind of the no-name guy, quote unquote, on the playground to being Mr. Popular. So now today in his adulthood, not only is he struggling with all the other stuff we're going to talk about today, for him on a core memory level, his brain links social acceptance with porn. Right.
Yeah.
And it's just one key example in which this can
Yeah.
happen and does happen all the time with the
Another
guys that we
really
work with.
another really common scenario we have run into with betrayed partners. As we know as teens, that insecurities and not feeling like you measure up, or that you're pretty, or that you're handsome, or whatever, is a big issue. So a lot of the girls I've worked with have said, I felt pressured to give in to my boyfriend's demands that I do things he was viewing in pornography, or I wasn't dateable. I
He's going to
wasn't,
go elsewhere.
he's going to go elsewhere.
Yeah.
And I was very needy to have that reassurance and that acceptance and his affection. So I found myself giving in to this horrific nonsense. And so we see that as well. I think, Steve, as you and I talked about this leading up to recording this, we felt that one of the most important questions in trying to tackle this question was, and we would submit this to everybody listening, what role do you want sex to play in your relationship?
Mm.
How many of you have really talked in deep, raw, authentic, genuine conversation? What role do we really want this sexual aspect to play? Do we want it to be a piece of and part of the overall holistic intimacy puzzle? Do we want it to be the be all end all that pretty much is our intimacy that dictates everything else we have? What do we want? What role does it play? That's a really important discussion and exploration and conversation to have. Otherwise, you're just going to kind of be, I call it led around with kind of a ring in your nose.
Totally.
Being told how to think about all this. This is all going to be dictated to you. And the sad thing, Steve, you and I talked about, is when we rely on this sexualized culture, peer influences, pornography, Hollywood, whatever, to dictate to us what sex means and what role it should play and how we should be, participating in it with each other. If we allow all that to dictate to us, what are we missing? We're missing this beautiful opportunity for the two of us to come together in communication and exploration and collaboration to figure out what we want sex to be for us. It goes from sex being their way to sex being our way. And the crazy part is I've studied for many years the whole pornography industry, their intentions, their models, and I won't go into that. But if you rely on that source as what will dictate the sexual intimacy that you have, you're relying on a source that does not have your best interest in mind at the smallest degree. They are manipulative, they are usury, they are all about enslaving and capturing a marketplace and controlling it. So when you let that be the dictating force, you miss out on all that you could have shared together to develop your own approach, your own intimacy, your own whole building of your physical relationship is entirely and utterly up to you, unless you let someone else dictate it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and so you can just, and we could go on all day about the culture. I know we have to move on
Yeah.
because otherwise we're going to be stuck here. We're never going to get past and get into the question here. You can see this world that each of us as addicts, as partners, frankly, all of you as parents are up against, right?
Wow. Overwhelming.
And so that's a whole other podcast, right? For
Yes.
another day. Um, so
Well,
this,
I was just say, Steve,
yeah,
you
go
were
ahead.
talking really cool before we started, because I know you're passionate about this and you've looked a lot at this at the neuroscience and psychology. Porn is a source of our so-called sexual intimacy information.
Jeez.
What happens when we use that source and from the whole sexualized culture as our source of how to go about this?
Hey, everybody. It's your PBSE podcast co host here, Mark and Steve, with a special message to all of you about our revolutionary recovery program for addicts, spouses, and couples, Dare to Connect. Nearly every day, we receive messages from subscribers in the program, couples who are just like you, trying to heal from the devastating effects of sex addiction, pornography addiction, and betrayal trauma. Recently, we actually received an amazing feedback message of hope from a current D2C subscriber, and we wanted to just share it with you quickly. She says, "This is a partner. I am grateful that while you fully address this addiction as a disease and that it takes over the addict's life, you both also fully address the impact their behaviors and their betrayals have had on the partner. Your words and teachings on partner betrayal trauma opened my husband's eyes to his responsibilities and role in helping me heal. He has stepped fully into the gap to lead this process, and we are making such progress. I originally started D2C by myself as my addict partner was not interested in anything I had to say about recovery. He was working recovery through another program, but his work was off limits to me. I had listened to so many of your PBSE podcasts, and I realized that I needed more than I was getting through my own support group. So I signed up for the Dare to Connect 2-week trial."
And then she continues. She says, "One night, my husband looked over my shoulder and asked what I was doing. I shared Dare to Connect with him. He tried it, and he's been fully engaged ever since. Steve and Mark's knowledge and experience speak to him, and he has implemented so many of the things that have been suggested. Thank you for your straight, hard-hitting approach. Keep it up. Our marriage has deepened tremendously, and we are stronger than we've ever been, even while working through the mess that this addiction has made. We're happy, loyal, and incredibly grateful D2Cers." We absolutely love these success stories. It's the reason why we do everything that we do in D2C, to help all of you find lasting recovery and healing. So come on over and join us in the D2C program. You can do it with a free 2-week trial, and you find that at daretoconnectnow.com.
Yeah. Well, and it's true. And I think at different times, as I look back on like my addiction history, well, addiction and even pre-addiction history, there were different times, not just the one that I described at the beginning of the podcast, where I would use this, I'm looking to acquire knowledge, right? Line of thinking as justification for this, right? And I think about back, because when I was a kid, I mean, my dad was an amazing father before he passed away. And he really was. He was an incredible dad, but he was a fan of the old school approach of having quote unquote the talk with you. And even though he may have said the right things, all I remember most about that conversation is just how uncomfortable he was, and therefore I was. And I concluded that I wouldn't be talking to him anymore about this. And
Right.
then, of course, he ended up passing away. And so I'm here as a young kid. I'm sexually curious, and here comes the internet into our house right about that time, and it was just sort of a bad time for everything. But as I look at that, and I look at, you know, the impact or the logic that I used either as an adult or as a kid of, well, I need to learn about this somehow, right? And so I just wanted to talk about the practical realities of that from a practical standpoint, because my brain, I'm very much a pro-con guy, right? So maybe I can speak in a way that some addicts would hear. Okay, this is probably not the best way to learn this, but I need to learn it somehow, and I don't know how else to learn. So let's learn it this way. Guys, here's the reality that I've learned, and I know Mark shares this same reality. What you learn, quote unquote, learn in pornography, not only does it come with all of the negative, harmful impacts that we're going to talk about today and have talked about before, but from that practical standpoint, the information that you gain, quote unquote, whatever it is, it's complete utter bullshit.
Yeah.
There's no healthy way to put that other than that it's nonsense. The things that we oftentimes talk about, one of the ways that pornography is so dangerous is the way in which it rewires the brain, not just from a pleasure perspective, although we're going to get to that in a minute, but from forming baseline realities about, for example, what a partner wants in a sexual relationship, how critical that sexual relationship is and what it means to them versus not. When you go through and you talk to actual partners, because Mark and I make a living doing this day in and day out about what value sex holds for them, why it holds that value, etc. As you go down that list, what you were taught in popular culture, certainly in the pornography world, could not be further off base from reality. So not only are you taking on all of the quote unquote negatives from using that as a teaching source, the information you're taught isn't even good on top of it. It's
true.
nonsense.
It's true.
It is a complete and utter setup for you to, well, I won't tell you where that was. It's not going to end in healthy connection with the people you want connection with. Let's put it that way. That's the best way to say it.
Yeah. And it's not going to lead you to what the true you way deep inside is yearning for, which is real intimacy. I long and yearn for real intimacy. Pornography has nothing to do with intimacy.
Connecting with pornography is connecting with the unreal on every level, including the ones you haven't even thought about yet.
Yeah.
It's not just unreal from the sexual place, guys. It's unreal from norms, values. And when I say value, I'm not talking moral values. I'm talking about what we value as people, what it means to connect with and to be truly integrated with another person, to see and be seen, to have and to be held. It's all of those core key values that transcend every culture, want, or other desire out there. We are wired for connection. We talk about this all the time here. And pornography builds a world and a premise that will lead you to nothing but the opposite. That's the factual reality. It's not a moral judgment. It's none of those things, although God knows one could make that. It's simply is that is the practical reality of what you're looking at. It is fake in its purest form. It's falseness in its purest form.
Well, and Steve, you and I talked about how much to go into the clinical side of this, the neuroscience, the psychology, and we want to do that for a minute here. And I spent many years studying with my mentor, who was a neuropsychologist. I studied heavily the neuroscience. I wanted to understand my own addiction, what it was doing to the world. And out of all that, 3 years of study came my first book, the drug of the new millennium, right? The brain science behind pornography use. And what we've learned since, that was clear back in the year 2000. And we have come, I thought people were going to string me up and put me away for forever for making such a bold claim. And since then, it's been well established that this pornography use, it literally rewires us in really significant ways. Whenever we have recurrent compulsive exposure to selective, isolated elements of human body parts, human sexual acts that are just isolated apart from the whole rest of the holistic intimacy of them, and we just focus on those parts and those pieces and those acts and positions, it rewires our entire pleasure system. Right, Steve, you call it our hedonic set point. I studied for years what it does to, for example, to the body's dopamine system. And Steve, I'd like you to talk for a minute about well, let me say, first of all, not only does that resetting of the dopamine and hedonic system and wiring, one thing it does is it brings about a situation in the sexual component of a relationship where an addict who's having that sole focus is going to find, because of the rewiring of his system, the same approach is not going to deliver the same response any longer. Things that we're doing sexually become boring to the nervous system. I have to keep pushing the envelope. I have to keep, trying new things out, new positions, new this, new that. It becomes insatiable when we hijack this part of our wiring system. And so it has horrible dysfunctional impacts upon our sexuality and sex in our relationship. But Steve, you've also looked over the years at what it does to just your ability to be overall happy in the first place, right?
Yeah. So we won't get into this a ton because we could easily get distracted on this. And I know some of you guys love this neuroscience stuff. Some of you don't. We get mixed opinions on this anytime we bring it up, but we love it. So for those who do like it, we'll get away from just talking in the lens we're talking about now. Let's talk scientific for a minute. If you there are lots of different models that describe how and why people feel the feelings that we feel. One of the models or paradigms out there is what we call the hedonic set point model. And essentially hedonic set points, they're just it's a really fancy term for what describe is used to describe how at what point chemically and otherwise the brain experiences different emotions or feelings. Okay. So for example, we're just using this as a very simplistic example. This is not scientifically accurate. Okay. Well, if we just took one chemical like dopamine, okay, in the brain, each person's brain has an idea of that their brain has formed about what is quote unquote happiness from a chemical standpoint based on the presence, accessibility, and the brain sensitivity to that chemical in the brain. Okay. And if we're just looking at the chemical side of this, because again, it's complex, if that chemical goes up or down, again, in a very simplistic model, a certain level of when that dopamine or the presence of it or the body's ability to uptake it feels that chemical to whatever degree it feels it at a certain level that marks happiness, a certain level that marks as feeling neutral, another level it's going to mark that, oh, this is sadness, or this is depressed, or this is really depressed, right? Or whatever the case may be. And when we talk about hedonic set points in addiction, this is applicable just as this originally this model used to just be applied to models surrounding chemical addiction, so alcohol, drugs, that kind of thing. What recent research is starting to show is that even though those chemical drugs do mess with hedonic set points in the way we're going to talk about here, emotional release drugs, quote unquote drugs, like sexually compulsive behavior can have the same impact on hedonic set points, meaning that the brain's adaptability around what it labels as quote unquote happiness, again, from like that dopamine or serotonin level, can be changed over time. When the brain becomes exposed to, for example, huge, crazy high amounts of dopamine, again, just using that as an example, far beyond what it was ever meant to be exposed to on a consistent basis, over time, there is the potential for the way that the brain interprets that level of chemical presence to, instead of that being now a pleasurable experience, that becomes more of what? It becomes more of just the standard quote unquote normal. That in turn shifts the other quote unquote hedonic set points and means that all of those other quote unquote levels of that drug in the brain, right? Where one used to represent happiness, one used to represent whatever. Let's say, just for sake of argument, that the happiness one gets knocked to now a place of, because the brain's become acclimated to the presence of that chemical all the time. Now that's the new normal. Guess what? Now the current level of dopamine in the brain, what used to be considered normal, guess how the brain registers it now? Oh, I'm sad. Yeah. I feel depressed. I hope I'm explaining this correctly, but the long and short of this, what this means is that over time, any drug or any compulsive behavior, including sex, and accessing it, and that does, by the way, doesn't just mean sexual release. Pornography is a huge catalyst for this in the brain. Over time, what this does is it disrupts your ability to healthily and accurately experience pleasure, pain, happy, sadness. The way that the brain gauges those things becomes dysregulated. So what used to quote unquote feel happy now may just be your metaphorical cup of coffee that gets you emotionally through the day on a baseline level.
Yeah.
Where you previously may have felt quote unquote normal most of the time, you may find yourself feeling depressed much of the time and not even know why.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, it drives it all down. And then as we finish up, then you have to ask yourself, okay, if I'm rewiring and reworking my whole chemical system, my hedonic set points, my dopamine system, so that my entire ability to regulate and feel happiness or sadness or what brings me out of that has been completely hijacked, what does that now do to the relationship?
Correct. My ability to show up in it.
Yeah, my ability to show up in it and be happy in it, connected in it. Then I find myself, and this was true for me, because I was in a pornography sexual addiction, when my dopamine system and my hedonic set points were down regulated. So now regular life just kind of became boring and depressing on a regular basis. Where did I then go seek to correct that? Back to the sexual outlets, the pornography outlets that created that dysregulation in the first place. Because my brain says, oh, I just need more of that and more of that and more of that. And I would bring that into my relationship. I just need more sex with my wife, more hot sex, more this kind of sex, more that, more often, longer. She needs to desire me. She needs to be the one leading out and asking for sex. And if all of that is happening, now I can feel normal. Now I
Mm.
can feel fulfilled. And you can see there, we haven't just had our entire dopamine system and pleasure system and happiness system hijacked. It hijacks as our relationship system. And now what we look to in the relationship to be in balance with each other, the priorities of how we spend time together. How do we deal with the instability of emotional ups and downs? How do we come at all of that? What's happened to our ability to collaborate? I said at the beginning that when we introduce this pornography and these other sexual culture influences to, quote, teach us or determine how we show up in this way in our coupleship, we have given away this aspect of our relationship to someone else to dictate. And we lose the opportunity to do it in our own unique, collaborative, creative, kind, compassionate, loving way. We give that to someone else and they hijack it. And our contention is if you allow that to happen, you have lost a giant part of the very fulfilling, connecting, joyful, amazing, passionate part of a relationship because you allowed that to be hijacked. And you've sacrificed overall holistic intimacy. It's 8 different areas for a narrow focus on just one.
Mm.
That's a big loss. Everything we've just described, it's like, wow, we are losing out. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Mm.
Well, we hope that this is kind of giving you an idea of where we come from on this issue and why this can be problematic. I wish that the news we just try to be honest here in this podcast. This is not a religious podcast. This is not a moral podcast. We try to come at this as objectively as possible based on our own experience. I guess the best way to kind of sum up what I'm feeling as we wrap things up is Mark and I, as we've said oftentimes on this podcast, we kind of are like social or not social, excuse me. We kind of almost were like sexual crusaders once upon a time. I remember when we first met years ago. One of the things that kind of drew me to Mark was how different, but also in many ways how similar our stories were. And one of those things was, I mean, I remember looking back, I think I really did kind of view myself, and I think Mark did too. We like, the old medieval knights, like with the big red cross on them. We were like sexual crusaders. We were on a quest for our own holy grail. And that holy grail was, how can I have the life and the benefits that come from a life of commitment and connection with people? Happy family, happy marriage, self-confidence, a healthy sense of self-worth, being connected with other people, minimal cognitive dissonance, etc. And there's got to be a way to somehow have that world, and we have to be able to match it with all these quote unquote benefits of addiction and what comes with that. And we both spent, between the two of us, a minimum of 30 or 40 years really on that quest, trudging through our own quote unquote mental holy land looking for it.
Yeah.
And if we had found it, we would tell you.
We'd have a podcast about that.
We would have a podcast about that. Yeah. And we'd probably make a lot more money. But we've never found it. That doesn't exist. That world is a myth. It's called chasing the unicorn for a reason. They're a nice idea and they sound really cute. And who wouldn't want to have a horn on the front of their head? But at the end of the day, it just doesn't exist. And the real accountability, real empowerment, that which Mark and I are all about, occurs when we are able to look at our setting, ourselves and our situation and our status, and be able to see what the roads lay out for us in advance on both sides, right? Because many of the guys sitting here and listening to this podcast are sitting at a crossroads like we were once upon a time. And Mark and I were always looking for door number 3. Show me door number 3, door number 1 and number 2. That's not acceptable. We're not about that. But when you finally come to a place of embracing the reality that I can have, as my wife put it to me the day where things began to change, you can have this world that involves me, Steve, and everything that comes with that world. Or you can have the other one. But you can't have both. The more, that's when I started to become, albeit begrudgingly, empowered. That's where Mark started to become empowered. It's when we were armed with the reality and the understanding of this is really what is on the line here. And it isn't about good or bad or who are people going to think about this. In fact, it has to do with the opposite. It has to do all in 100% with healthy selfishness. Every addict looking themselves in the eye and in a non-toxic way, because God knows we do that all the time, but in a healthy way saying, you know what, screw everything else. Am I really happy with the trajectory I'm on? And if the answer to that is honestly no, then what needs to change? If these two wingnuts that I keep listening to once a week on this podcast are telling me about these two choices, do I want to do something different?
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
I love that. I think my final words words of invitation are take back your sexual intimacy, your
I
sexual
love that.
power. Take back the holistic intimacy of your relationship and decide if you're sick and tired of letting outside sources dictate that to you and for you. Take it back. This is up to the two of you. Yeah.
I love that. I love the idea of taking it back. This is what we do in every day in our D2C programs. It's what we do in our individual clinics. We hope that you will come do it with us more than you are now. You are to a degree listening to this podcast. Level up your station, level up your relationship. Give that thing in your life that I think deep down all of you know is the most important thing out there for you, at least one of the top things. And let what you invest in it be reflective of that feeling. Come join us at Dare to Connect. We have a 2-week free trial going on over there. Come see what we're talking about. Earlier in this podcast, we talked about defensiveness. We just started a new monthly topic: defensiveness, defense mechanisms, and where they come from for addicts and partners. It's going to be an awesome month.
How to overcome them.
We'd love to have you come join us. So you can find all that at daretoconnectnow.com and grab the 2-week trial there. And if you are wanting to continue to submit us questions on the podcast, and we do hope that you will continue, we're 5 years and counting. If you go to daretoconnectnow.com and just up at the top, there's a banner up there that says, looking for the PBSE site, because we've integrated it now with our D2C site. Just click on the big red banner. You can't miss it. It's like offensive with all the other color palettes on the page. Click on the banner, and then just at the bottom, there's a contact form you can click on and send your questions into us just like normal. So.
Yeah. All right, everybody. Hey, thanks for being with us. We're going to be here, and we're going to plow forward to download 2 million.
Sounds like a plan.
All right. All right. Take care.
All right. Bye-bye.
Yeah.
Everything expressed on the PBSE podcast are the opinions of the hosts and the participants and is for informational and educational purposes only. This podcast should not be considered mental health therapy or as a substitute thereof. It is strongly recommended that you seek out the clinical guidance of an individual qualified mental health professional. If you're experiencing thoughts of suicide, self-harm, or a desire to harm others, please dial 911 or go to your nearest emergency room.